Alrighty, well, thank you so much for joining us today for our May industry webinar. Today's topic is periodic inspections and lockout tagout. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. All of these industry webinars, we record and distribute recordings after they're concluded. These go out to anyone who is registered or attended. So if you registered or attended, these will go out to you. If you'd like to ask questions throughout the webinar, you can do that in the Q&A section, and we'll publish those and try to get to all of your questions. We'll also answer some of the pre-submitted questions that you submitted when you signed up for the webinar. If we are unable to answer your question, we'll try to get back to you one-on-one after the webinar concludes. Our presenter today is Mr. James Junkin. He is the Strategic Advisory Board Chair here at VeriForce, and he's also the CEO of Mariner Gulf Consulting Services. He's also one of our master trainers for our learning content department in VeriForce. So, James, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for joining us today for Lockout Tagout periodic inspections, not just an annual review. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit about the Lockout Tagout standard, but really dig into the periodic inspection. We're going to look at some references, and we have attached as a handout to this webinar today, the CPL, which is the OSHA's instruction to compliance officers when they conduct inspections regarding lockout tagout. We'll go through all the components of the lockout tagout, periodic inspection, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions. Now, I'm going to be the first one to tell you I do not have any good lockout tagout jokes. Before we signed on, we were Googling for lockout tagout jokes. There are no lockout tagout jokes. So this is going to be a highly technical webinar, but I hope it's one that you'll find value in, because lockout tagout is one of the standards that OSHA routinely cites against, and is probably one of the standards that protects our employees the most when doing servicing and maintaining of equipment. So when is lockout tagout required? Anytime we're doing servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment in which the unexpected energization or startup of the machines or equipment or the release of stored energy could cause injury to employees. So if you're doing servicing, you're doing maintenance work under the lockout tagout standard here, that energy must be isolated. Now, there are three parts of an energy isolation program. There's the energy control procedures, employee training, and periodic inspections. Now, I want to talk just briefly about the difference between an energy control procedure and a policy. Many of us have lockout tagout policies, and it's an overreaching, if you will, document, overriding document that details how we go about implementing our lockout tagout program. We upload those policies to like VeriForce under the special program evaluations function. Those are graded by a great team at VeriForce against the standard. But that's not an energy control procedure. That's a policy, right? The energy control procedure is actually how we go about locking and tagging a machine out when it comes to energy isolations. Then there's employee training. We'll get into what employee training is a little bit later in this presentation. And then the periodic inspections. Now, why are periodic inspections part of this? And what is a periodic inspection? This is probably the most misunderstood, provides for the most confusing parts of any OSHA standard. In the assessments that we do for VeriForce, the deep dive contractor assessments at VeriForce, routinely we find that people are either A, not conducting a periodic inspection correctly, or B, not conducting a periodic inspection at all. OSHA included periodic inspections in its energy isolation standard in 1910-147 in order to verify that employees were following the proper procedure and that the procedure was appropriate for the machine or equipment that was being isolated. So it's a very important portion of what your energy isolation program is. It will catch deficiencies within either the procedure or employee training prior to having an incident. So like I said, there's just all this confusion out there about periodic inspections. In preparation for this webinar, I did a quick search on Google for periodic inspection forms just to see what was out there. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of hits when it comes to periodic inspection forms. You can customize the form to what your need is, but it is not an annual review. There are specific things from the standard, from the OSHA instruction that have to be included in your periodic inspection and certification. And we're going to go through that today. So just a reminder, we're not talking about your overall policy. Like you see pictured up here on the left, it says lockout, tagout, and the screen that you're seeing. That's a policy, right? But you need a procedure and a periodic inspection. And we're going to get into that in great detail as we go through this webinar today. So let's talk about what some of the references are, so you can get on the same page when it comes to lockout, tagout, and the periodic inspection. The first is the standard itself. And you can just go to the OSHA's website, look up the standard at 29 CFR 1910-147. The second is also included as a handout in this webinar today, and that is CPL 02-00147. That's the OSHA instruction to the compliance officers of what to look for when conducting an OSHA inspection with regards to lockout, tagout, and specifically the periodic inspection. OSHA also offers some great tools in developing energy isolation programs. Your lockout, tagout e-tool, which can be found at osha.gov/e-tools/lockout-tagout, is an excellent resource for you to improve your energy isolation program or develop an energy isolation program. Now let's talk about the periodic inspection, right? A lot of confusion about this and what its purpose is. Many people have been seriously injured and killed for failure to properly isolate energy. Lockout, tagout, including periodic inspections, are always in the top 10 of the most cited OSHA standards. Now, some years it's 5, some years it's 7, some years it's 6. The ranking moves around, but it's always consistently in the top 10. So that tells me that people don't understand the inspection process. They don't understand completely everything there is to know about lockout, tagout. And I routinely find a lot of errors in the lockout, tagout process when I do assessments of companies in the field. So what is it? This is the inspection process. Number one, it's required annually. Required annually. That's within a 12-month period. It has to be conducted by an authorized employee. Now let's talk about that just for a second. Words mean things inside these standards. So as you look at this presentation, it's always good to be able to go back into the source documents to see what the definitions are of things like authorized employee. When we're dealing with lockout, tagout, there's an affected employee, then there's an authorized employee, and there are other employees. So an affected employee might be an employee whose job requires him or her to operate or use a machine or piece of equipment on which service and maintenance is being performed. An authorized person is a person who's performing that service and maintenance. They're the ones that lock out or tag out the machines or pieces of equipment while they're doing that. They're the ones who potentially are exposed to energy sources that can cause injury or death to the employee, right? So an authorized employee is one that is doing the work and must place a lock and or tag on each energy isolation device. So when we're talking about periodic inspection, the work is being done by an authorized employee, and the inspection must be conducted by an authorized employee. An authorized employee other than the one who's actually doing the lockout tagout procedure. So the reason I want to stop here on this is who is doing the evaluation. You have one or more employees who are authorized workers who are actually performing the lockout tagout procedure. Then another authorized employee is observing that. Well, can that authorized employee be your safety person? Possibly. But that safety person has to be deemed an authorized employee who is familiar with the energy isolation process for that particular machine or piece of equipment. So it's more than just a manual review. It's more than just a demonstration, right? It is someone who understands the process, the procedure of energy isolation for that particular machine and equipment, observing another employee or another group of employees that is utilizing the procedure at the time. So what are we looking for? We're looking for in that periodic inspection that they understand the process of energy isolation, the procedure, and they understand their responsibility under the blackout tagout procedure being inspected, and that inspection must have a certification. And we're going to talk more about that as we go through this webinar today. A certifying document that the inspection has been conducted. Now, the lockout tagout periodic inspection must contain at least two components. Number one, an inspection of each energy control procedure that's required under the standard, right? So the energy control procedure is the steps necessary to isolate this machine or equipment from an energy resources. Now you'll notice down here in number 2, we talked about a little bit a minute ago, a review of each employee's responsibilities under the procedure that's being inspected. Now, in my note, energy control procedures that are not required to be documented under the documentation exception must still be inspected and or reviewed to ensure that they are adequately and properly being utilized. There's an exception to this rule, and there are 8 parts of that exception. We don't have time to go in there and look at those parts that are there for the exception in this webinar. Maybe we'll do that in a future webinar. But for most cases, many of you, there's no exception to the periodic inspection 2 components. The inspection of each energy control procedure and a review of each employee's responsibilities under the energy control procedure that's being inspected. Now, what is it not? Okay. A periodic inspection is more than an annual review of the lockout tagout program. And I want to have this as a great piece of emphasis during this webinar, because many times in the assessments that we go out and conduct for Veriforce, what we find is when we say, okay, show me your energy control procedure, they show me a policy that they've submitted to our SPE review department and it's passed. The policy is the overarching document. The procedure is how the lockout tagout is to be performed. So simply going to your policy, looking at it to make sure that that policy has been updated, it's still compliant with 1910-147, and changing the date is not enough. It's not enough to meet the annual periodic inspection requirement under the standard. So it's more than just an annual review. And the purpose of this is not retraining. So bringing your workers in and retraining them as authorized workers and conducting a training class again, that's not the purpose of the periodic inspection. Again, this is a frequent cause of worker serious injury and death, inadequately applying energy isolation devices, or not applying them at all. And like I said, this is one of the OSHA's top 10 most frequently cited in 2023. It was number 6 last year with over 2,500 cited violations. So it's not just an annual review. You actually have to follow the specific guidance in the CPL and in the OSHA standard. All right. Now, how do we go about doing the periodic inspection? There are 2 components here. By observing the implementation of the energy control procedure for the servicing and or maintenance activities being evaluated. This cannot be just a walkthrough saying, all right, how would you go about, locking and tagging this out? You actually have to see them implement the energy control procedure for that particular machine. So it has to be an actual performance evaluation. So first thing is we observe the implementation of the energy control procedure. Number 2, by talking with employees implementing the procedure to determine if all the requirements of the lockout tagout standard understood and being followed. And like everything with OSHA, there is, sometimes exceptions to rules. So if you were a really small company and you only had 1 authorized worker and it was impossible for you to meet this requirement, then the COSHOs have to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis in accordance with the impossibility affirmative defense. In other words, we can't do this because it's impossible, because we're a small company, we only have 1 authorized worker, etc. But for most of us on this webinar, that exception is not going to apply to the operations that we have. At a minimum, these inspections must include a demonstration of the procedures. Now, between the standard and in the CPL, when they use the word inspector, they mean the authorized employee who's been trained in lockout tagout, who's familiar with the procedure to conduct energy isolation on this machine. That person, that authorized worker that's conducting the periodic inspection, sometimes is referred to as the inspector. So anytime I say inspector, I mean that authorized employee, that person who understands, has been trained in energy isolation, and is knowledgeable of the procedure that is being used to conduct energy isolation, right? So, number 1, got to have a demonstration. Must be performed while the authorized employees perform service and maintenance activities on the machines or equipment, and it may be accomplished at various times. So it can be randomly. We know we have maintenance schedule. We go out randomly check a group of employees that's conducting energy isolation on a particular piece of machine or equipment to make sure that they are following the correct procedure, right? And they have knowledge, skills, and abilities sufficient enough to protect themselves. So it can be random. It could be a safety tour. It could be, a planned visual observation process. However you want to do it, it just has to be done within that 12-month annual time frame. Component 1 of the periodic inspection. From the standard, the periodic inspection shall be performed by an authorized employee other than the one utilizing the energy control procedure being inspected. So I want to emphasize this, and I know it sounds like it's being a little bit repetitive, but people mess this up all the time. Someone other than the person who is actually performing the energy isolation has to conduct the periodic inspection. So in our example and picture on the screen, that person applying the locks and tags there cannot self-evaluate. They cannot be part of the process. It's an observer that's observing the process and the energy control procedure. According to the letter of interpretation, which you see here in October of 1996, Mabley's letter to OSHA, they were asking, could consultants be hired to conduct periodic inspections? And this was sort of OSHA's position on this. The answer is yes, if they meet the following criteria. So an authorized employee is a qualified person who has the authority and responsibility to perform a specific lockout or tagout inspections been given to that person by the employer. So you could have a consultant come in. They have to be authorized by the employer and understand the process for energy isolation for that machine or piece of equipment. A qualified person is a person who's been trained and has demonstrated proficiency in compliance with the standard to perform servicing and maintenance on the machine or equipment to be inspected. So it's two parts here. Number one, I understand lockout, tagout. Number two, I understand how it applies to this particular piece of machine or equipment. That can be a third party as long as they have that understanding. Now, hiring James as a consultant to come out to do your periodic inspection might be difficult because James does not have the demonstrated proficiency of the understanding of the energy isolation procedures for every piece of machinery and equipment on this planet. So sometimes we find when people do periodic inspections, the inspector, whether internal or external, doesn't have the demonstrated proficiency. They understand lockout, tagout from a general standpoint. They understand sources of energy. They understand different methods of energy isolation, but they lack the knowledge of what's going on with that particular piece of machinery or equipment. So in most cases, when we see periodic inspections done correctly, it's not the safety team that's doing the periodic inspection. It's not an outside consultant that's doing the periodic inspection. It's another authorized worker who has familiarity, who is qualified, if you will, that understands the energy isolation procedure for that particular piece of machinery or equipment. And that's really the spirit of how OSHA intended it to be. So, again, someone who has previously or currently implements the energy control procedure being inspected. That's the key. This may be someone who has previously has or currently implements the energy control procedure being inspected. So make sure whoever's conducting your periodic inspections that they have knowledge of the energy control procedure they're inspecting for that particular piece of equipment, not just general lockout, tagout knowledge like most of us get in awareness level type training. All right. The inspector also must be able to determine whether, number one, the steps in the energy control procedure are being followed. Again, the procedure is not your policy. The procedure is how to lock and tag out, how to energy isolate this particular piece of machinery. It's a step-by-step guide on energy isolation. So you got to be able to determine whether those steps are being followed. Whether the employees involved in this process know their responsibilities under the procedure, and is the procedure adequate to provide necessary protection? And if inadequate, what modifications are needed? So you can see we're moving well beyond just general knowledge when it comes to energy isolation and lockout, tagout. You have to be familiar with what's going on with this machine or piece of equipment and what's going on with the employees that are involved in the energy isolation process. That way, if there are gaps, we can get people retrained or we can change the procedure. It must be done at least annually based on 12-month intervals. So here's an exception to that rule. So if you have a piece of machinery that you're not servicing and maintaining every year, right? It may be every 2 or 3 years, or only as needed. Then that would be an exception to this periodic inspection 12-month interval. However, you'll have to do the inspection before you go out and do the servicing and maintenance. So energy control procedures used less frequently than once a year need to be inspected only when used, but that inspection has to happen before you go out there and actually perform servicing and maintenance. All right. So you may be saying, wait a second, this is crazy. James, there's no way, based on our plant, based on the operations we have, all these different energy control procedures, that we can do this. That it's just too much to be able to periodically inspect all these employees, all these procedures once every 12 months. Well, here's some good news. According to the standard, an employer may group distinct procedures associated with similar machines or equipment and consider the group of distinct procedures to be a single procedure for the purposes of conducting a periodic inspection if the machines or equipment in the group have the same or similar type control measures. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, but you can group machines together. You can group equipments together, as long as it meets specific criteria, similar control measures, similar hazards. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we get into this. So, coming from the CPL, ways to convert distinct energy control procedures into a single inspection. Now, you may consider the group of distinct procedures to be a single procedure for the purposes of conducting a periodic inspection, as long as it complies with Section 9 of Chapter 3 of the CPL, which I provided here as a handout. On the inspection document, all the machines and all the equipment have to be listed and identified in the scope. The machines or equipment in the group have to have the same type and same magnitude of energy, and they have to have the same or similar control measures. So if it meets all those, then you're good to go. If you're not, you're going to have separate procedures. So if you're going to group all this together, number one, it's got to all be on the inspection document, what machines or equipment are listed there, grouped together. They have to have the same type and same magnitude of energy, and they have to have the same or very similar control measures. The single procedure must satisfactorily address the hazards and specify the measures for controlling the hazards. So that one inspection, that one procedure that you're inspecting cannot have any outliers. Well, but for this one, there's something else. Or for this one, you have to go over here. They have to have the same or similar steps for shutting down, isolating, blocking, securing, and dissipating stored energy. Same steps for the placement, removal, and transfer of lockout tagout devices and the responsibility for them. And the same requirements for testing to verify the effectiveness of lockout tagout devices and other control measures. If it meets all that, you can have a single procedure. And normally what we find this is particularly related to similar machines that may be installed in the field, that are from the same manufacturer, that are the same make and model, or in a plant situation where we have machines or equipment in series that meet the same criteria, same make, same model, or maybe it's a different model, but it contains the same magnitude of energy, and the lockout tagout procedures is similar or the same. Okay. So here's an example. This comes from the CPL. So here it is. You've got these particular presses here, right? You could write a single procedure, but that procedure needs to be sufficient in detail and clarity to guide a die setter safely through the task when servicing each of the power presses. You could do that, number one. You could write a single procedure, or number 2 here, bullet point number 2, you could develop separate procedures for each machine. Either one of those would be acceptable, as long as the energy control procedure details provide the authorized employee with enough information and guidance to safely accomplish all die setup tasks. So you can do a group procedure, like in bullet point number 1, or you can have a procedure for each of these machines. It's up to you. What you can't do, all right, you cannot have 2 dissimilar process systems grouped together. So here you have ammonia refrigeration system at the top. Well, that's got different magnitudes of energy, maybe different isolation points than this natural gas heating system, right? So you will have to develop 2 different procedures because you've got unique or different energy sources, or to supplement a single generic procedure. Another key component in this is the machine's functions. How the machine actually works is not the significant factor, okay? It's not the significant factor. So machines that are designed to perform different production functions may be covered under a single procedure if the procedure is clearly and specifically detailed with the same or similar energy control measures. So if the lockout tagout procedure is the same, you could group together even though they have different functions. But the guidance in the procedure has got to be sufficient enough to be able to allow each authorized worker to safely and effectively utilize those control measures to protect themselves. So just because the machines do something different, as long as the hazards are the same and the controls are the same, they can be grouped into a distinct procedure. All right. Now, when we talk about lockout tagout standard, it's what OSHA calls a performance standard. It doesn't really tell you how to go about achieving all the results, but it tells you that what the results need to accomplish. So it focuses on the achievement of desired results. It doesn't exactly tell you how to achieve those results, right? You know, there's no question about whether or not you're going to comply. You have to comply, but it's not explicitly stated how you're going to comply. So remember, lockout tagout is a performance standard. They're not going to tell you exactly what type of formula you need to use, how it needs to lay it out. It just needs to be reasonably effective. So your procedure inspections must reasonably reflect your plant or company servicing and or maintenance operations and practices. Why do I put that in there? Beware going and downloading generic stuff from the internet. Use that as a basis, as a foundation to build your periodic inspection process. But it needs to be unique to the situation that you're in, right? OSHA's not going to tell you how you have to do it. They just tell you have to do it. Lockout tagout is a performance standard. All right, the second component of the periodic inspection, the review with authorized employees. All right, the inspector does not have to observe every authorized employee using each energy control procedure that they're qualified to use. Instead, the inspector can observe and talk with a representative number to gain understanding of the work practices at the site. So as long as the number of people that you're being evaluated in the periodic inspection is reflective of the energy control procedures, you don't have to do everyone in your organization, but it needs to be representative, right? It can be a representative number. What's that number mean? Well, probably more than one. Probably more than none. I would say, you know, a plurality, if you will, of employees to make sure that, one, the procedure is effective, and two, employees understand their responsibilities. If you're going to do representative periodic inspections, then you have to share the results of that inspection in group meetings with other authorized employees. Now, it may not be practical for those authorized service maintenance employees to review every procedure they will implement, but before servicing, they must review the inspection results from the machine or piece of equipment that has previously been inspected, right? So you got to keep up with these inspection records because they need to be made available to those folks who are not part of the periodic inspection. If you find during the periodic inspection that the procedure is deficient, then you're going to make modifications to that procedure. And we find this all the time. Then that's when retraining would apply. All right, let's talk about training versus retraining. This is what most people get. General lockout, tagout training, right? And we're going to talk about Veriforce's new course, Lockout, Tagout, for authorized and affected employees as we get toward the end of this presentation. But that's what that is. That's general lockout, tagout training for authorized employees. It says, authorized employees shall receive training in the recognition of applicable hazardous energy sources, the type and magnitude of the energy available in the workplace, and the methods and means necessary for energy isolation and control. Affected employees shall be instructed in the purpose and use of the energy control procedure. Then you've got other employees who are just around the areas, and their training is even less specific, in which they shall be instructed about the procedure and about the being prohibited relating to attempts to restart or re-energize machines or equipment which are locked and tagged out. So general lockout, tagout training for authorized workers and affected workers just focuses on the things that you see, the general type and magnitude of energy available in the workplace and how you go about doing energy isolation, different methods, whether it's blocking, whether it was actual locks and tags, a lot of different things that come in specific to your organization. But you still have to train people on the procedure they're going to use when conducting energy isolation for the machines or equipment that they're servicing and maintaining. So general lockout, tagout training is not enough. It's not enough to run somebody through a 2 or 4 hour class on lockout, tagout, authorized person training. I just assessed a company yesterday whose general lockout, tagout training was 26 minutes for authorized employees. Now, at first glance, you may say that's not sufficient, and that's what I had as well. But then, supplemental to that, they also had specific training for energy isolation for each machine and piece of equipment that those employees, those authorized employees, were expected to apply lockout, tagout devices to. And that's sufficient to meet the intent of the standard. When is retraining required? When we have deviations from the energy control procedure being implemented. So when we're doing the periodic inspection and we find that people aren't following it exactly as it's detailed, then it's time to do retraining. If we're questioning employees and having that discussion and we find inadequacies in their knowledge and regarding energy control procedures or its application, then retraining is required. And if we find out during our inspection that the control procedure we're using is inadequate, then we have to retrain. And obviously, if we get new equipment with new lockout, tagout procedures, right? Here's the other thing about retraining. When do we have to retrain people? It's not required when inspections do not reveal any deficiencies. It's another benefit from doing periodic inspections. There's no annual requirement. Bloodborne pathogens, we have to train on that every year. Hearing conservation every year. Energy isolation, we do not have to do retraining if the inspection does not reveal any deficiencies. Okay? The third component of the inspection is the certification. And this becomes difficult for people to fulfill. There's a lot of confusion about this. We find it wrong all the time. This is different than a knowledge, skills, and abilities checklist, right? So what must the certification identify? This has to be a document that, number one, identifies the machine on which the procedure was being utilized, the date of the inspection, the identities of the employees included in the inspection, and the identity of the person who performed the inspection. Then the employer must certify if training or retraining took place. So what information must appear on the certificate? Each employee's name and the dates of training and retraining, if that had to take place. If there was nothing found in the inspection that was deficient, then there's no need to put anything about training or retraining on the certification because it doesn't apply. Remember, you only have to do retraining if there are deficiencies. Okay? Now, why is this important? If you're inspected by OSHA, beyond the additional safe measures that this periodic inspection is giving you as far as confidence in your energy isolation program, it also is a means of documented compliance with the standard. So by having this, the inspectors, the compliance officers, can determine your compliance with 1910-147. Okay, but most importantly, it's there to verify that our program is protecting our workers. All right, so here's the conclusion. Veriforce is launching May 31st. Lockout, tagout, authorized person training. Now, that authorized, affected, and authorized worker training, right, is exactly what we're talking about when it comes to generalized lockout, tagout training. This is not awareness level training, right? This is training for you to use to combine your company's specific energy hazards into this program to grant authorization for workers who are performing servicing and maintenancing. But you still have to train them on the procedure in which they're going to use for each type of machine or equipment that they're servicing or maintaining. Why did we do this? Veriforce's mission is to bring workers home safe from high hazard jobs. And energy isolation and the failure to control hazardous energy sources has seriously injured and killed thousands of workers. So in our effort to bring more workers home safely, we're launching May 31st, Veriforce's Lockout, Tagout for affected and authorized worker training. The benefits: this is a targeted training focused on reducing serious injury and fatality incidents among workers performing servicing, maintenance, and repairs on machines or equipment that have energy sources. So it's meant to protect the workforce and comply with the OSHA regulations that we've talked about today. It's instructor-led. It goes through both theoretical and compliance training, but also has knowledge, skills, abilities, and practical assessment checklists that come along with this so that you can verify worker knowledge. Moves well beyond just a multiple choice test. It is very comprehensive. We're going to go through a wide range of topics for authorized and effective workers to include the recognition of energy sources, the methods and means necessary for energy isolation to be in compliance with OSHA standards. But understand, you still have to train them on the procedure they're going to use for each type of equipment or machine that they're isolating. So, you know, as a learner, as a participant in this course, you'll leave understanding the significance of proper energy isolation, conduct thorough evaluations and assess lockout, tagout skills, and implement practical strategies within your organization to reduce serious injury and fatality incidents.
So James, we got a question in. We go into substations and the company that owns the sub has a lockout tagout in place. What are our requirements as a subcontractor when entering the lockout tagout area?
Great question. This is where we find a lot of confusion. Okay. So number one, you're a contractor working for a company. The company owns that piece of equipment. That company should provide you with a procedure for energy isolation for those pieces of equipment. What you don't want to do is be in a situation where they lock it out and you work on it. The standard says every person with the potential to be injured shall place a lock and or tag on each energy isolation device. Now, they may come out and perform energy isolation and put their lock on, but you got to put your lock on too. Nowhere in the standard does it say the employer is not responsible for their employees. So as a contractor, when you go into a situation like that, you still have to provide energy isolation devices, training, methodology, program, inspections, everything as if you own that particular piece of equipment. So while the hiring client may put their locks on, you need to put your locks and tags on as well, and follow that process and procedure as if you own the equipment.
Awesome. Okay. Our employees who lock out on the equipment or process lines that are to be worked on do not have the same knowledge of how the process works like the client's operation team does. Does this not allow them to act as an authorized employee to perform the periodic inspection, or would this fall on the client to conduct the periodic inspection?
It falls on you to conduct the periodic inspection, but you have to have enough knowledge, whoever's conducting the periodic inspection, of where the energy isolation sources are and the procedure that you're going to follow to conduct the energy isolation. So sometimes that means we have to go back to drawings, right? And make sure that we're hitting all of these energy isolation points. And this is something I see rarely done. We just trust that the hiring client knows that these locks and these valves that we're locking out are sufficient to protect our workers. If they make a mistake, who gets killed? Our guys. So to prevent that from happening, we have to understand how this is locked and tagged out, how the energy isolation procedure works, and then an authorized employee who understands that will conduct the periodic inspection for your company. That's preferred method. Could you use someone else? Absolutely. That's in the letter of interpretation from Mabley. You could use a client, a hiring client person to conduct the periodic inspection as long as they have knowledge of the energy control procedure. So it could go either way.
Then is this a requirement for all companies or a recommendation?
This is the law. You will get a serious citation for not doing periodic inspections. And you will get a serious citation for each machine or equipment of which you have not conducted the energy control procedure. So you could end up with multiple serious citations here. So, you can group them and all that other stuff, but assuming they're dissimilar, that could be a citation for each one of those processes, for each employee exposed during those processes. So yeah, it is not a recommendation. This is the law. If you want to learn more about how OSHA would conduct the inspection, I've included that handout, which is the CPL 0200147. That will tell you exactly what the compliance officers are looking for in the inspection. Now, when do most lockout, tagout, OSHA inspections occur? Post-incident. You get somebody seriously injured, you get somebody killed, they're going to go through your lockout, tagout program with a fine-tooth comb. And these are areas often where we find deficiencies, and the whole purpose of doing the periodic inspection is to avoid those type of incidents. To make sure, number one, the procedure's good and employees understand the procedure. And if either one of those are not correct, then we've got retraining and modifications of the procedure as corrective action.
And then this one, a pre-submitted question. Do you have to have on lock time and removal time in advance of using a lockout or tagout?
That's not in the standard. A lot of people do that. You just have to have a tag that has identifiable the person who placed the lock and or tag on there. That has to meet means of identification. Most people use a tag that you can put folks' names on there. Sometimes they put their pictures. Sometimes they also put their phone numbers. Those are extra to what the minimum requirements are within the standard.
Gotcha. Should we require our employees to complete our company-specific JHAs, even though the hiring client completes their own?
That's really by preference. There's nothing. You're responsible for your work, right? So I always say, in my recommendation, this is James's opinion, complete your own job hazard analysis, because you're responsible for the protection of all those employees. The employer, that's you, has the responsibility for identifying all recognized and predictable hazards. So you don't want to outsource that to someone else, if that's the question. If the question is, whose form do we use? As long as the form is adequately has the steps that you need to follow to complete the process, the hazards associated with each steps and how you're going to control those hazards, who made the form is really irrelevant.
Gotcha. Our lockout tagout is based on electrical isolation through switches and grounding in the sub. Can you elaborate on all of the lockout tagout OSHA compliance requirements?
How much time we got? I don't know if I can elaborate on all the requirements, but when we get into electrical safety, now we're talking about things that have specific standards within OSHA that go beyond just the lockout tagout standard. Then you also have to consider your requirements under NFPA 70E. So when we get into electrical substations, things of that nature, it gets a lot more complex because of the magnitude of the energy sources. So I think it's like 503, I think, is the citation. I could be wrong on that deals with power generation, distribution, transmission. OSHA has a vertical standard on that. That's where I would start. NFPA 70E, and then, of course, 1910-147. So it's very, very complex when we're talking about substations.
Gotcha. We got two more questions, James. For the contractor placing locks on the hasp, do they have to have training that would allow them to isolate the equipment independently, or only awareness of where the energy is coming from and how the isolation procedure isolates?
Great question. They have to have authorized worker training. They cannot have just awareness training. Now, look, the word awareness is never used by OSHA, ever. Ever. That's something we made up in industry. Okay? You're either an authorized employee or you're an affected worker. If you're performing service or maintenance on any type of equipment, you must be trained to the authorized employee level, which means I could come out there and conduct a periodic inspection and ask that worker, okay, how do you go about conducting energy isolation? They're like, I don't know, my boss said put a lock here. That is not going to work. That's not going to work, okay? You have to understand the sources of energy that can cause injury to the employee, okay?
Awesome.
So one of the best places to go, 1910-147, read the definition of authorized employee under the standard.
And then the last question, does a semi-trailer need a tag if it's out of service? What's
the energy source? Probably not. Probably not. I would think not. You know, you have to have a hazard and you have to have exposure. So the standard says the unexpected startup or energization of a piece of equipment or machine that could injure a worker. So you got to do the evaluation. How is that trailer going to unexpectedly start up? If it can unexpectedly start up and injure a worker, then lockout tagout would apply. If it can't, it won't.
Awesome. I think this is a similar question to one before, but I'll go ahead and put it out. How should an electrical contractor approach lockout tagout when they are the only contracted for the specific job of servicing non-live electrical lines for repair or installation?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, the key component is non-live lines. And the answer to that is this. Can that line be unexpectedly started or energized? If it can be, lockout tagout applies. If it can't be, and there's no possibility for that, then there's no requirement under the standard. But you still might do it just as an extra precaution. Now, many times what you'll find is there's OSHA rules and regulations, and then there's client expectations that may exceed those OSHA standards. So if you're working in somebody else's house, you have to follow their rules, right? And that might be a rule that is something that you routinely see at a hiring client's location, not necessarily found within the standard.
Awesome. And this is just a comment that came in, but it seems like a pretty important one. Sometimes people confuse lockout tagout versus security locks.
You know, the standard doesn't say what kind of lock, right? But most people use some substantial lock, like a padlock. It could be a master lock. It could also be a lock that comes from a lockout toolkit that many people buy at safety supply stores that are dedicated to lockout tagout and lockout tagout only. Now, whether you use a padlock that's a master lock or a kit from a safety supply store, those locks have to be only used for lockout tagout, have specific markings on them dedicating them to lockout tagout, and be keyed with a single key so that worker is protected. There are not multiple keys out there. Remember, the goal is to protect the worker. The goal is to limit the amount of communication that's necessary to perform all this lockout tagout stuff. Because the more people communicate, the more potential for failure there is, and the likelihood of worker injury or death is increased.
All righty. And another comment, outstanding presentation and instructor. So glad I participated in this class. So kudos to James. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This is this is very technical. It's very technical. But sometimes it's a technical that gets us in trouble. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I apologize. I don't have any cool lockout tagout jokes, but I got a lot of bad lockout tagout stories when we don't do it right.
Well, James, thank you so much. Really great information and content today. As I mentioned, there's some information in the handouts. If you'd like more information on the course that we're launching on lockout tagout, just hit that yes on that poll. We'll be in touch with you. And then April, I'll see your question here. In our follow-up email, you can respond to that. Ask any kind of lockout tagout questions. We can reply and get you connected to the right person.